A black boy shocks the courtroom by telling the judge, "You're my father." What happens next leaves everyone speechless. The air in the courtroom was heavy, an unspoken tension filling every corner. 8-year-old Malik sat on a chair far too big for him, his legs too short to reach the ground, swinging idly as if trying to find balance in a world that often felt overwhelming. His dark, curious eyes moved across the room, taking in the adults who seemed to be deciding his fate as though he were a puzzle to solve. Beside him sat Mr. Jenkins, his foster father, whose reassuring hand rested firmly on the boy's shoulder. Jenkins was a solid man, both in build and demeanor, with a kind face that had earned Malik's trust over the past year. Malik leaned slightly toward him, as if drawing strength from his presence, even as his gaze drifted toward the figure seated high on the bench at the center of the room. Judge Thomas Reynolds was a man of undeniable authority, his reputation preceding him in every family court case he presided over. At 54, he had spent the better part of 3 decades navigating the murky waters of custody battles, adoptions, and family disputes. His thick gray hair and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of unflinching wisdom, though his expression often betrayed a hint of weariness. He sat with his back straight, his hands folded as he listened to the arguments unfolding before him, his gaze occasionally flicking to Malik. The case at hand was one Judge Reynolds had seen variations of before, though its complexities still weighed on him. Malik had been placed in foster care 3 years earlier, following the death of his mother. Since then, he had moved through 3 different homes, each experience leaving its own mark on the boy. His current foster parent, Mr. Jenkins, had provided a semblance of stability that had begun to help Malik heal. But now, a new family, the Whitakers, a well-off couple from the suburbs, had petitioned for custody, citing their ability to provide Malik with better financial resources and a 2-parent household. The debate between the attorneys was clinical and sharp, each presenting their case with practiced precision. The Whitakers' lawyer emphasized the couple's clean record, their spacious home, and their ability to offer Malik opportunities that his current foster home could not. The attorney gestured toward the couple seated nearby, both dressed impeccably, their polite smiles radiating an air of capability. On the other side, Mr. Jenkins's lawyer highlighted the bond Malik had formed with his foster father, arguing that uprooting him again would cause emotional harm. Malik's file was heavy with notes detailing the challenges he had faced in previous placements, feelings of abandonment, trust issues, and a growing sense of fear that no home would ever truly be his. Jenkins had been the first to break through those barriers, providing the boy with a sense of belonging that could not be measured in dollars or square footage. Malik watched it all quietly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He didn't fully understand the legal jargon being thrown back and forth, but he knew enough to grasp the gravity of the situation. These adults were deciding where he would live, who would care for him, and whether he would have to leave the only home that had ever felt safe. Judge Reynolds listened intently, his expression neutral but attentive. Every now and then, his gaze lingered on Malik, as if trying to glean something from the boy's demeanor. There was something about Malik's steady, watchful eyes that caught his attention, a quiet strength that belied his young age. Finally, the attorneys paused, and Judge Reynolds leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk in front of him. His voice, calm and even, broke the tension. He directed his questions to Malik, addressing the boy with a gentleness that was uncharacteristic of his usual stern demeanor. Ethan asked Malik whether he liked living with Mr. Jenkins, how he felt about the idea of moving to a new family, and if he understood what was happening in the courtroom. Malik answered softly, his responses simple but thoughtful. He told the judge that he liked living with Mr. Jenkins, that the thought of moving again made him nervous, and that he knew the people in the room were deciding what was best for him. The courtroom fell silent again after Malik's words, the kind of silence that magnifies every creak and shuffle. Malik's gaze moved back to Judge Reynolds, who was watching him closely, his piercing eyes softened with curiosity. Malik took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling as he gathered his courage. He hadn't planned to speak up like this, but something in him said that now was the time. The room seemed impossibly large as he looked directly at Judge Reynolds, his voice breaking the silence in a way that no one expected. "You're my father," Malik said, the words steady and clear, though his voice was soft. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. For a moment, no one moved. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Mr. Jenkins froze, his hand still resting on Malik's shoulder. The Whitakers exchanged bewildered glances, while their attorney stood with her mouth slightly agape. Even the court stenographer faltered, her fingers pausing above the keys as if unsure how to record what she had just heard. Judge Reynolds's expression shifted for the first time that day. His composed, authoritative demeanor cracked under the weight of Malik's words. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes widening as he stared at the boy. Malik didn't waver. His dark eyes locked with the judge's, his expression earnest and unwavering. His small hands tightened around the arms of his chair, as if bracing himself for the storm that was sure to follow. Judge Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically unsteady as he addressed the boy. He asked Malik to repeat himself, though it was clear he had heard every word. Malik did, his voice even softer this time, but no less firm. "My mom told me," Malik explained. "Before she got sick, she said my dad was someone important. She said you didn't know about me." The room erupted into a cacophony of murmurs and exclamations, the orderly proceedings of the court devolving into chaos. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel, his hand trembling slightly, calling for order. But even as the noise subsided, the shock of Malik's words lingered, reverberating through the courtroom and settling heavily on every person in the room. The courtroom froze in the wake of Malik's declaration. A collective gasp rippled through the small audience, disbelief written across every face. The lawyer for the prospective foster family dropped her pen, her mouth parting slightly in shock. Mr. Jenkins stiffened, his hand instinctively tightening on Malik's shoulder as though to anchor the boy in place. Even the court stenographer, whose fingers typically flew across the keys with unwavering precision, hesitated, her hands hovering above the machine as if unsure how to capture the moment in words. Judge Thomas Reynolds sat frozen behind the bench, his composure cracking in a way no one in the room had ever witnessed. He blinked, his normally steady gaze faltering as he leaned back in his chair. For a man who prided himself on his ability to remain impartial and unaffected, the boy's statement had landed like a thunderbolt. Malik remained unfazed by the growing tension around him. His dark eyes stayed fixed on the judge, unwavering in their quiet determination. His small frame seemed to radiate an unexpected strength, as though he had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone could have imagined. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, swelling into a tide of speculation and disbelief. People whispered furiously to one another, their voices filling the courtroom with a low hum of chaos. The attorneys at the plaintiffs' and defendants' tables exchanged bewildered glances, their carefully rehearsed arguments forgotten in the wake of Malik's shocking words. Judge Reynolds finally moved, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his gavel. He brought it down with a sharp crack against the wooden block, the sound cutting through the noise like a knife. "Order!" he called, his voice firmer than his expression betrayed. The room quieted, though the weight of Malik's statement hung heavy in the air. Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice carrying a tremor as he spoke directly to the boy. He asked Malik to explain what he meant, his carefully measured tone unable to mask the unease bubbling beneath the surface. Malik hesitated for the first time, glancing sideways at Mr. Jenkins. The older man gave him a slight nod of encouragement, his hand still resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. Reassured, Malik straightened in his seat and spoke again. "My mom told me," Malik said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of innocence and conviction. "Before she got sick, she told me my dad was someone important. She said he didn't know about me. She showed me a picture once, and it was you." Judge Reynolds's face turned pale. His blue eyes widened, and his lips parted slightly as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. For a moment it seemed as though the world had stopped around him, leaving him alone with the weight of Malik's words. The room erupted into chaos once more. Lawyers stood to object, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of legal jargon and demands for clarification. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, whispering furiously as they craned their necks to get a better look at the judge and the boy. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel again, calling for a recess. His voice, though still authoritative, wavered slightly at the edges. He announced that the court would reconvene in 30 minutes, his gaze avoiding Malik's as he stood and quickly exited the courtroom. Back in his chambers, Reynolds shut the door behind him and leaned heavily against it, his breath coming in uneven bursts. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. He walked slowly to his desk, his movements mechanical as though he were operating on autopilot. Sitting down heavily in his chair, Reynolds buried his face in his hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a physical force. Malik's words echoed in his mind, unraveling years of carefully constructed certainty. Could it be true? Reynolds opened the bottom drawer of his desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he rummaged through its contents. At the very back, beneath a stack of old documents, he found what he was looking for, a small, faded photograph. The picture was over a decade old, its edges worn and slightly curled. It showed a younger version of himself, standing arm in arm with a woman who had once meant something to him. Her name was Angela, a warm and spirited woman he had dated briefly during his late 30s. The relationship had ended abruptly when Angela had moved out of state, leaving behind little explanation and no further contact. He stared at the photograph, his eyes lingering on Angela's face. Memories surfaced unbidden. Her laugh, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of challenge and affection, and the sudden, unexplained distance that had grown between them in the weeks before she left. Had she been pregnant? Reynolds shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. Angela had never mentioned a child, never reached out to tell him anything about Malik. But if what the boy said was true, it would explain her sudden departure and her silence in the years that followed. The gavel, the robe, the courtroom, all of it seemed impossibly distant now. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt the foundation of his carefully constructed world begin to crack. He sat in silence, the photograph still clutched in his hands, as the questions swirled endlessly in his mind. Could he have a son? And if he did, what did that mean for everything he thought he knew about his life? The courtroom had ordered a DNA test to determine whether Malik's bold claim about Judge Reynolds being his biological father had any merit. The request was made quickly, but the weeks that followed stretched longer than anyone could have anticipated. In the quiet moments between the frenzy of the case, the weight of the potential revelation gnawed at Judge Reynolds's mind. He had always prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, his ability to make difficult decisions with precision and confidence. But now, in the quiet of his office and in the stillness of his home at night, he found himself haunted by the boy's words. Malik's declaration, so simple yet so profound, repeated over and over in the judge's thoughts. The more Reynolds thought about it, the more he wrestled with the possibility that the child Malik described might actually be his son. The doubt crept in slowly, and with it came a flicker of hope, a small, fragile thing that perhaps the boy was not just a stranger to him, but someone whose blood ran in his veins. Despite his internal turmoil, Judge Reynolds had no choice but to continue his responsibilities. He was still the judge, still tasked with presiding over cases, still the impartial authority that his courtroom expected. Yet, every time he looked over the documents or reviewed his notes on another case, he couldn't shake the thoughts of Malik, sitting in that courtroom with those dark, earnest eyes fixed upon him. Outside the courthouse, the case had taken on a life of its own. News outlets had latched onto the story like a wildfire, sensationalizing the details and speculating about the implications of the scandal. Reporters staked out the courthouse, their cameras and microphones always in place, waiting for the next bombshell. The headlines painted Judge Reynolds in a new light, questioning his personal life and scrutinizing the years of his career that had seemed so perfectly unblemished. The media circus only added to the strain Reynolds felt, the spotlight growing brighter with every passing day. Through it all, Mr. Jenkins stood as a steady presence for Malik. The boy, though calm on the surface, had been processing the events with a quiet intensity. It was clear that he, too, was grappling with the sudden uncertainty of his life. Was Judge Reynolds truly his father? What did that mean for his future? Would he leave the safe haven that Mr. Jenkins had provided for him? But Mr. Jenkins, a kind and dedicated foster parent, remained his constant. He comforted Malik when the boy grew anxious, reassured him when the questions began to pile up, and protected him from the chaos outside the courtroom doors. He knew how important this time was for Malik. The boy needed to feel safe, and Mr. Jenkins did everything in his power to ensure that he did. Then, one morning, the results of the DNA test arrived. Judge Reynolds sat in his office, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he stared at the envelope in front of him. His heart raced, a mix of dread and anticipation flooding him. The moment had come, and he knew that everything he thought he understood about his life would change. He tore open the envelope, unfolding the paper carefully as his eyes scanned the document. His breath caught in his throat when the results confirmed what Malik had said. Judge Thomas Reynolds was, in fact, the biological father of Malik. The revelation hit him like a wave, crashing over him with overwhelming force. There was no denying it now. Malik was his son, a child he had never known, a part of him that had been lost to time and circumstance. The emotions that followed were a blur of disbelief, confusion, and an almost painful sense of responsibility. Reynolds set the paper down, his hands trembling slightly, the weight of the discovery sinking in. The ramifications of the test results were far-reaching. Judge Reynolds had to acknowledge the inherent conflict of interest that now existed in the case. His role as a judge, overseeing the custody battle, was no longer viable. With a heavy heart, he submitted a request for temporary recusal from the case, ensuring that another judge would take over the proceedings. But even as he stepped back from the courtroom, Reynolds couldn't escape the pull of his newfound fatherhood. He knew that he needed to make a connection with Malik, to understand who the boy was and what he had gone through. The revelation, while a shock to his system, also created a powerful urge to be part of Malik's life. He wanted to understand the boy who had claimed him, to find out what it meant to be his father after all these years. Reynolds requested supervised visits with Malik, acknowledging that he had no right to simply walk into the boy's life without first building trust. The request was granted, and the first meeting was set. The day of the visit arrived, and Judge Reynolds, now simply Reynolds, found himself standing in the hallway outside the room where Malik waited. His hands were clammy, his mind racing with uncertainty. He had presided over countless cases, making life-altering decisions for others, but now he was on the other side. He was the one who had to begin the process of healing, the one who needed to forge a relationship with a child he had never known. Malik sat on a small bench in the room, fiddling with the hem of his shirt as he glanced nervously at the door. His quiet demeanor had not changed, but there was a tension in his body, an awareness of the magnitude of the situation. When Reynolds stepped into the room, he was momentarily unsure of what to say. The judge, so accustomed to controlling the courtroom, suddenly found himself fumbling for words in front of the boy who might be his son. Malik looked up, his dark eyes meeting Reynolds with a calmness that made the judge's heart twist. Reynolds cleared his throat and tried to smile, though it felt awkward. He introduced himself again, though they both knew who he was. Malik nodded, his expression guarded but curious. They talked about small things, Malik's favorite hobbies, his school, his life with Mr. Jenkins. Reynolds found himself listening intently, asking questions that seemed simple but carried weight. Malik responded with quiet confidence, speaking about the things he loved: his drawings, his love for basketball, his desire to make Mr. Jenkins proud. His words were steady, though there was a faint trace of uncertainty in his voice when he spoke about his life before coming to live with Mr. Jenkins. It was clear that the boy had been through more than any child should. As the visit continued, something shifted. Slowly, the distance between them began to close. Malik's guarded demeanor softened as Reynolds shared stories of his own childhood, of the things he loved, and even of the mistakes he had made in his life. The conversation, at first stilted and formal, began to feel more like a tentative connection. There were still many barriers to overcome, many layers to peel back, but in those first moments together, something real was formed between them. By the time the visit ended, Malik was more relaxed, and Reynolds was left with a bittersweet feeling, pride for the boy's strength and sadness for the time lost. There was much more to be done, and the path ahead was uncertain, but it was a start, a fragile, tentative start that promised hope for the future, for a father and son who had only just begun to find one another. The courtroom was more crowded than it had ever been. The tension was palpable, with every seat filled, and the gallery lined with people eager to see how the case that had captivated the community would conclude. Reporters sat with their notepads ready, their pens poised to record the final verdict in a story that had grown beyond a simple custody battle. This wasn't just about where Malik would live, it was about the boy's future, and the man who had unknowingly shaped it from afar. Malik sat quietly at the plaintiff's table beside Mr. Jenkins, his small hands folded in his lap. He looked calmer than anyone else in the room, his expression one of quiet determination. Beside him, Mr. Jenkins wore a similarly composed demeanor, though the faint tightness in his jaw betrayed the tension beneath. On the other side of the courtroom, Judge Thomas Reynolds, no longer wearing his judicial robe, sat at the plaintiff's table for the first time in his career. For decades, he had presided over cases like this one, delivering verdicts and shaping lives with a firm, impartial hand. But today, he was simply Thomas Reynolds, a man trying to find his place in the life of a son he had never known. The proceedings resumed with closing arguments. Mr. Jenkins's lawyer spoke first, her tone measured but impassioned. She recounted the stability that Mr. Jenkins had provided for Malik over the past year, painting a picture of a home where the boy had begun to thrive. She described the bond they had formed, how Malik had finally begun to heal after years of instability. The lawyer emphasized that uprooting him now, even in light of the recent revelations, could jeopardize that progress. Her words were powerful, and as she spoke, Mr. Jenkins sat a little straighter. His gaze flickered to Malik, a faint smile breaking through the tension as he saw the boy's steady confidence. Then it was Thomas Reynolds's turn to speak. Rising from his seat, he adjusted his tie, his normally steady hands trembling slightly as he faced the room. He had always been in control in this space, his voice carrying authority and finality. But today, his tone was different, raw, uncertain, and deeply personal. He began by acknowledging his absence from Malik's life. He spoke candidly about his ignorance of Malik's existence, his regret for the years he could never get back. His voice cracked slightly as he described how much Malik's words had shaken him that day in the courtroom, forcing him to confront parts of his past that he had long buried. Reynolds didn't make excuses. Instead, he spoke of his desire to be part of Malik's life, to take responsibility for the relationship they had both been robbed of. He promised to be patient, to build trust and understanding slowly, and to never disrupt the stability that Mr. Jenkins had given Malik. As he spoke, Malik's eyes stayed fixed on him, his expression unreadable. The room was silent, every word hanging heavily in the air. When Reynolds finished, he returned to his seat, his heart pounding. He glanced at Malik, hoping for a sign, but the boy's gaze had shifted back to the table in front of him. The judge presiding over the case called for a brief recess before delivering the final ruling. When the court reconvened, the judge addressed the room, his voice calm but firm. He acknowledged the complexities of the case, noting the unique circumstances that had brought them all to this moment. In his ruling, the judge prioritized Malik's stability, granting primary custody to Mr. Jenkins. He emphasized the deep bond Malik had formed with his foster father, stating that it was in the boy's best interest to remain in the home where he had finally begun to flourish. However, the judge also recognized the importance of Reynolds's role in Malik's life. He granted Reynolds joint custody, allowing him to build a relationship with his son over time, under the guidance of supervised visitation until they had established trust. The decision brought a sense of resolution to the courtroom. There were no outbursts, no objections, just a quiet understanding that this was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. In the weeks and months that followed, Malik's life transformed. He remained in Mr. Jenkins's home, where the routines and stability he had grown accustomed to continued uninterrupted. But now, there was something new. Visits with Reynolds, who had taken a temporary leave of absence from the bench to focus on his relationship with Malik. The first few visits were tentative, with Reynolds treading carefully as he learned about the boy he was only just beginning to know. They spent time together at the park, where Malik taught Reynolds how to play basketball, laughing at the older man's awkward attempts to keep up. They shared quiet moments over ice cream, talking about Malik's drawings and his dreams for the future. Over time, the walls between them began to crumble. Malik's guarded demeanor softened as he saw Reynolds's genuine effort to connect with him. The bond they formed was slow and fragile at first, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Reynolds, for his part, found himself transformed by the experience. For so long, his life had been defined by the courtroom, by the cases, the rulings, and the sense of control it gave him. But now, he was learning to let go of that control, to embrace the uncertainty and vulnerability that came with fatherhood. Months later, Malik thrived under the care of both men. He split his time between Mr. Jenkins's home and visits with Reynolds, finding a sense of belonging in both places. His once uncertain future was now filled with hope and love, the scars of his past slowly fading. The courtroom, where Malik had first spoken those life-changing words, now stood quiet, its walls bearing witness to something extraordinary, a moment that had reshaped lives and forged unbreakable bonds. Malik's journey, and the unlikely family that had formed around him, was a testament to the power of truth, love, and second chances.